Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video I am going to present to you the most beautiful PC ever made. I know this is a pretty subjective remark, but this IBM Personal Computer AT, or Advanced Technology, released in 1984, a 16-bit machine with a 286 CPU, remains one of the most beautiful retro PCs ever made. Now, before we continue, I would really appreciate if you would consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you like retro PCs, repairs, and all of the above, check out my back catalog featuring lots of cool retro stuff. I try to put a lot of effort into these videos, and subscribing to the channel really helps out in terms of getting the content out there. I really hope to welcome you as a subscriber, and I hope you enjoy this and future videos. So let's kick things off. When this PC was released in 1984, they took on a new case design that looked totally different from the existing IBM PC and IBM PC XT. I am also fortunate enough to combine this computer with this IBM EGA display, the 5154 enhanced color display. This display is a big step up from the CGA screen, as you can display up to 16 colors at the same time on this display. So this makes for an excellent combination with this IBM Personal Computer AT. And for the icing on the cake, obviously we need to have a keyboard for this computer, and what better thing to have than this IBM Model M keyboard. This is a gorgeous keyboard in excellent condition. Again, a perfect match for this IBM Personal Computer AT. The early IBM Personal Computer ATs came in fact with a Model F keyboard that was AT compatible. But this one just looks really gorgeous with the standard Model M keyboard. And from every angle possible, this PC is just a beautiful piece of equipment. I mean, just look at that case and just look at how well it combines with this IBM monitor and keyboard. I mean, this is just the perfect business computer, and it's really a joy to use today. Now, IBM has released a lot of different flavors of the Model M keyboard. This one has the gray IBM logo on the left. You also have Model M keyboards with, a more standard IBM badge on the right. You have ones with a blue logo, but this is an excellent keyboard to pair with this computer. If we look at the front, we have the IBM Personal Computer AT badge. We have a key lock on this case, which was also a first for IBM, allowing you to lock the PC and the keyboard. And we also have two LEDs, one for the power and one for the hard drive, also a first. Unfortunately, I don't have the key. We have the traditional grille that we also saw with the IBM PC and PC XT, but this case is a lot more square than that IBM PC and PC XT case. The unit here comes with two floppy drives. We have a 5¼ inch 1.2 megabyte floppy drive and a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive. Now, typically these only came with a 1.2 megabyte floppy drive. A big step up from the original 360 kilobyte PC floppy disks that came with the IBM PC and IBM PC XT. Included with the IBM 5170 was also a 20 megabyte hard drive, hooked up to an MFM 16-bit ISA controller card. This one here doesn't have a hard drive, so we'll go into the storage options later on. What we do have is the clunky IBM power switch to turn on the PC. Moving to the back, we see the IBM 5170 badge. So this is the model number for this IBM PC AT, made in Scotland, United Kingdom. So this is a European model with the power supply set to 230 volts with auxiliary power for a monitor. Now, this IBM PC AT could have been equipped with a CGA, MDA, EGA, or even PGA video card, so lots of display options. We have a power input and power output for the monitor. Obviously, we also have the fan. Next to the power supply, we have this battery compartment here, which can hold a battery for the real-time clock, which was also a first for these IBM personal computers. And we have an indication of the overall weight of the PCs, which is 20 kilograms. And here we have the standard AT 5-pin DIN connector for the keyboard. And finally, we have a number of expansion cards installed in this PC. So let's go over them. On the left here, we seem to have a SCSI connector, we have a serial and a parallel port, a sound card, and a video card, which has this switch here, some DIN connectors, RCA style connectors, and a 9-pin D-sub connector, and perhaps there are also some additional cards in the PC. But now, moving on to the monitor, and this is the IBM Enhanced Color Display, the EGA offering of IBM, the IBM 5154, which is kind of a unicorn in the retro computing land. It has a very nice power toggle switch. It has controls for the brightness and contrast. And, you know, it's just one of those things which is really hard to find. I'm really fortunate to own one and to pair it up with this IBM 5170. So here we have the 5154 badge on the back of the monitor. We have the power input. We have two knobs here for the vertical size. And the cable that goes out of this monitor is obviously a 9-pin D-sub connector, typically used in these pre-VGA type of video signals. On the back, we also have some additional information here. So this was a monitor model 5154002 manufactured for IBM, so not manufactured by IBM. It was made in Finland and certified by TUV in Germany. So yeah, this is just a picture-perfect retro PC. So time to turn it on, and we'll start with the monitor with a very satisfying power switch. When the monitor is turned on, you will see a lot of flickering when there is no video signal being fed into the monitor. But as soon as you start the computer and a video signal is fed into the monitor, the flickering goes away, and after a while you will actually hear the monitor syncing up to the video signal, and you will see the memory count on the top left part of the screen. And it's doing its memory count all the way up to 2 megabytes. So that is good. So that means that there is a memory expansion here. And then we get a 601 diskette error followed by the Adaptec SCSI board initialization. It does find a hard drive, it does install the BIOS, and it does continue with the boot process. We see the 1.2 megabyte floppy drive initializing, and we see that it's booting from the hard drive. Now, I did try the 5.25 inch floppy drive, and it did work. I did notice that it was set to the letter A, so that appeared to work. I wasn't able to get the 1.44 megabyte disk drive to work, so I'll need to figure out what was going on there. But you know, at least we have it booting from the hard drive or the flash storage, and the floppy drive works, so that's already really good. Now I wanted to show you some games that use the EGA color palette. I'm going to start with Lemmings, which does have an EGA version. And you know, it actually looks pretty good. It doesn't look all that dissimilar from the VGA version, so definitely a big step up from the CGA version of Lemmings. So yeah, this is really great. Games like Tetris also make full use of the EGA color palette, so you can display lots of more colors than you would on the CGA version of this game. You know, Stunt Car Racer also has an EGA version. Really nice color palette with the green and the blue and the red. So yeah, it's really nice to play these games on an EGA version. Just look at this pixel art here. And you know, because this also is a 286, it does have a speed bump advantage over the IBM PC and the PC XT, so you can play some more demanding games also. I remember, for example, Test Drive on an IBM PC or PC XT was really slow. Now on this AT machine, it's not a speed demon by any means, but it is definitely a lot more playable. And again, good use of the EGA color palette. You know, I like the green and the brown and the red and the gray that you see in this game. Again, especially compared to the CGA version, which looks absolutely horrible as any CGA game for that matter. Another really cool game is Cosmos Cosmic Adventure, which is a platform game. This, I think, was released in the early 90s, so it's a bit much for this IBM AT 286, but I mean, it has gorgeous graphics and the colors are really, really cool. Now let's load up Check-It to see what kind of hardware that we have here. So we have the 286 processor AT class machine. We have a Math CoPro, the 287, 640K of base memory installed, and 1.5 megabyte of extended memory, giving it a total of 2 megabytes. We have the EGA video adapter. It has detected the floppy drive as a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive, which is kind of odd. We do see the 2 gigabyte of fixed disk drive storage, so this is obviously flash-based storage. But no serial port or no parallel port found, despite the fact that they are present on the back. We do see 2 joystick ports. Now, if we look at the overall system performance of the machine, so Check-It has this kind of built-in benchmark. So we see it being detected as a 286 running at 8 megahertz. And then it can also benchmark the video card and the actual math speed of the system. Now we see a similar thing with System Check. We have the 8 megahertz 286, 2 megabytes of RAM. Again, the 1.44 megabyte floppy drive and the absence of the serial and the parallel port. And here we can also see the date of the BIOS, which is the 15th of November of 1985, which is the latest IBM BIOS version for this machine, which does support the 1.44 megabyte 3.5-inch disk drives, something that the other earlier revisions of the BIOS did not support. System Check also has a built-in benchmark, and again, it does detect the CPU as being 8 megahertz with a throughput speed of 9.8 megahertz. And last, Landmark Speed Test also detects the CPU as a 286 8 megahertz with an actual speed of 8.2 megahertz. But now let's open up the machine to see what we have inside here, because I do believe that this machine isn't properly configured yet. We can definitely use it. We can boot off from the storage. We can make use of the 1.2 megabyte floppy drive, but let's see what we have inside. So we have a couple of expansion cards. We have the flash storage here, which appears to be a SCSI 2 SD card thing. There is room for a hard drive. We have the 2 floppy drives here and the power supply. So yeah, the machine is in an excellent condition. It's not dirty at all. It's really clean. So let's take a look at the various expansion cards that we have just to see what this machine is capable of. And we'll start with this little card here at the bottom, which is the video card, the EGA card, 8-bit ISA card. We're going to be looking at that in a bit. We have a 16-bit ISA sound card, so obviously an advantage of using these AT class machines is that you have 16-bit ISA slots. Here we have an AST Advantage card, which has the 1.5 megabyte expansion. We have an Adaptec SCSI controller with a floppy drive connector and a SCSI connector. So the floppy drive was in fact hooked up to this Adaptec card, so that could explain the BIOS, the IBM 601 error we got at the beginning. Now, the first thing I noticed on the motherboard was the CPU, which appears to be an AMD 286 running at 16 megahertz, while in fact all of the benchmarks that I showed you earlier showed it as an 8 megahertz 286. So more on that in a bit, but let's continue with the disassembly. So the SCSI 2 SD adapter board is actually from an online store which sells, Amiga parts. So this is obviously a popular part in the Amiga world. So this basically just converts a SCSI controller to an SD card interface. So it also has the shortest SCSI cable I have ever seen, though that's why it was mounted or taped on that drive bay here. We have a couple of connectors for the PC speaker. Luckily they are marked, so you can't put them in backwards. We also have a connector here for the key lock and the 2 LEDs. There is also a battery pack here. So this was one of the first computers from IBM which had a battery-powered RTC clock on the motherboard. We have the standard AT style power connectors, and the original battery pack is still located here on this machine. So this was a Panasonic lithium BRE3 6.3 volt battery pack. There's nothing in here, so it uses a separate battery pack. So the motherboard is held onto the case with just 2 screws. Let's go ahead and remove that battery pack here. And then we should be able to just slide the motherboard right on out. And here we have it. I mean, this is just a really beautiful motherboard for this IBM 286. So let's take a closer look. And at the heart of this motherboard, we have the AMD 286 running at 16 megahertz. Now, this is a bit surprising. Why do we have a 16 megahertz CPU in the system? While in fact, originally this was a 6 megahertz machine, and later revisions of the machines did in fact come with an 8 megahertz CPU, as most of the benchmark applications show it here. But this is definitely a 16 megahertz CPU, and it's not the original CPU that came with this machine, because the first revision of the IBM AT machine used a 6 megahertz 286. Later revisions used an 8 megahertz 286. And a while back, I did another video of the IBM personal computer AT. Now, the one shown here was actually an IBM PC AT that I acquired after the one that I showed in the beginning of the video. And, this particular one was a real horror story. I have a separate video on that. There was battery leakage all over the place. So if you like that kind of stuff, I encourage you to take a look at that video. And that particular PC came with an original IBM 286 running at 8 megahertz in a 68-pin ceramic PGA package. Where on this particular machine, it uses this adapter to convert between the 68-pin LCC CPU package to a 68-pin ceramic PGA package. And here we can see the CPU from this machine, and this is a CPU that I got from another IBM AT. In this case, it's a Siemens 286 running at 8 megahertz, while on this machine we have the AMD 286 running at 16 megahertz. Now, the fact that this 16 megahertz CPU is only running at 8 megahertz could have something to do with the IBM BIOS which is installed here. Now, despite the fact that this is the latest BIOS that IBM released for this machine, I do believe that something inside this BIOS will limit the speed and will top it off at 8 megahertz. On the motherboard, we also have 512 kilobytes of RAM on board. So this is a 512K system board. We have 2 banks, 8 chips plus 1 parity chip each, giving this a total of 512 kilobytes of RAM. This is a 16-bit machine, AT class machine. So we have 16-bit ISA slots. We also have a couple of 8-bit ISA slots. We have an AT keyboard connector. So this was the first computer that used AT style keyboards. We have the power connector here, which is a standard AT style power connector. We have a switch here, and this switch is used to determine the video mode that you want to use. We have a Mathco Pro installed on this machine. So this is a 287 running at 8 megahertz. Now, during the disassembly, I showed you this battery pack, and that's because this computer has the Motorola real-time clock chip, which is battery backed, of course. Now, because this is an AT machine with a 16-bit architecture, we have not one, but we have 2 DMA and IRQ controllers, because this system offers us 15 IRQs and 7 DMA channels. A big upgrade from the 8 IRQs and 4 DMA channels on the IBM PC and IBM PC XT. Now on to the expansion cards, and we'll start with the sound card. So this is a fairly standard 16-bit ISA sound card from Analog Devices with an Opti chipset. It has a CD-ROM interface. It has the Philips amplifier chip here. We have a wavetable header, some connectors for the CD-ROM audio, and the standard connectors on the back. For the storage, we have a SCSI controller from Adaptec, the 1542, and on this card we have not only a SCSI connector, but we also have a floppy drive connector. So the floppy drives were in fact installed on this Adaptec SCSI controller. We also have an external SCSI connector, so that will explain the disk drive error, because I do think that these IBM PCs expect at least one disk drive to be installed using a standard disk drive controller. For the video card, we have an EGA offering from Video 7 using this CHIPS P82C434A chipset. Now I am going to be exploring all of these cards and the machine in more detail in a later video. But for now, I mean, we have the standard 9-pin D-sub connector, we have some RCA connectors, some dip switches, and a main switch here. Not really sure what this one is doing at the moment, but I will find out. And last but not least, we have this big guy here from AST. This is the Advantage card, and this offers a whole bunch of RAM chips, bumping the memory from 512 kilobytes to 2 megabytes of RAM. We have a whole bunch of dip switches here to configure the memory sizes. We have a parallel port and a serial port, which seems to be disabled on this card because none of the applications were able to detect it. But yeah, here we see the individual memory chips and the dip switches to configure them. So the serial and the parallel port were probably disabled using these dip switches, so I'll need to find out why that was done. And here we also have the SCSI to SD adapter. So this uses a micro SD for storage, and we have, you know, the standard SCSI connector here, which uses a standard Molex connector for power. It has the terminators here on this IC socket, and yeah, it uses this chip to convert the SCSI to the micro SD. I think this is one of those Cyclones PGA chips. Now this is my second SCSI to SD card adapter. The first one I blew up by inserting the Molex connector in the wrong way, which was pretty unfortunate. Now this is kind of an alternative for the XT IDE style interfaces. I mean, having flash-based storage is definitely really handy, but there are issues with this IBM 5170 when using the universal XT IDE BIOS, so that's probably the reason. But obviously nothing beats the original sound of the IBM Seagate hard drive that came with the IBM 5170 originally. In a previous video I showcased this hard drive a little bit, and although I don't have it anymore and I don't have a hard drive in this machine, I do prefer the flexibility of the flash-based storage. But yeah, if you're lucky enough to have an IBM 5170 with the original Seagate hard drive, I would definitely urge you to keep it. I mean, this is just a fantastic piece of engineering. I mean, just look at the size of this thing when compared to this already big power supply, and also the sound that it makes when you turn it on, and especially also when you turn it off. It has this really clunky sound that it makes, which is really awesome. So yeah, as much as I like working with these old hard drive, and especially these original IBM parts like this Seagate MFM 30 megabyte hard drive, I do prefer the flexibility of the flash-based storage when I'm doing testing. So yeah, I'm gonna say goodbye for now to this MFM hard drive. And one final thing I wanted to show you was the BIOS of the 5170. Now there are different ways of configuring the 5170. I'm just gonna be using a third-party tool which is called G-Setup. And as you can see here, the floppy disk A is indeed configured as a 1.44 megabyte disk drive. Now this is in fact the reason why we saw this 601 error, the diskette error, while booting the computer, because this IBM computer expects to have at least one disk drive attached to a disk drive controller on the computer, and because we currently have the disk drive hooked up to the Adaptec SCSI controller, the computer will give an error. But the floppy disk drive will work because it is being initialized through the SCSI controller, so yeah, not ideal, but not too bad either. So yeah, that's it for this first part, a high-level overview of the IBM AT 5170 with the 286 CPU, an absolutely beautiful machine that we will be taking a closer look at in a future video. For now, I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel. It would help out a lot. Please give me your comments. I would be happy to read and answer them, and I hope to see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.